Hello and welcome back to the Rise and Fall of the Chill Out Room, a history of ambient house and ambient techno from 1989 to 1996. Today I'm finally closing up 1993. 93 was when ambient exploded. Fittingly, it was also the year the Ambient Compilation properly launched. Not only did Beyond's Ambient Dub series continue after its first successful instalment from 92, but a large number of now very fondly remembered series began. All of the key labels of the era ran their own compilations, frequently licensing tracks from each other and introducing listeners in different territories to what the international scene had to offer. With its sci-fi cover, Rising High's first Chill Out or Die set was mixed by Mixmaster Morris, and features 3 of his own tracks, including a pair of remixes, as well as tunes by Namlook, Bedouin Ascent, UFO Rhythm, Uwe Schmidt Project Ongaku, as well as a few obscurities. No exclusives, but a wonderfully mixed set of strong tracks. The less aggressively named Chill Out, the Techno Evolution Continues, was Instinct Records' first major ambient release, and as the title suggests, they were very excited about this new step in the techno evolution. Blending tracks from the Instinct label with those licensed from other labels, many familiar names are here: Omicron, Young American Primitive, The Irresistible Force, Air Liquide, KLF, Earth to Infinity, Moby, Human Mesh Dance, and In Existence, mislabeled as Moonwater. An uncharacteristically sparse Meat Beat Manifesto track also appears, as well as relative obscurities from Joe Bogart and Michael Candel, plus a selection of laid-back one-offs from dance artists. As with many of these sets, it's not a treasure trove of rarities, but an excellent time capsule that will have been many people's introduction to some of 90s ambient's big names. Silent Records' From Here to Tranquility series also began in 1993, launching the label's new modern ambient approach with a first volume boasting an essay about the evolution of culture and humanity. That aside, it features some of the most obscure tracks of any of these compilations, with several one-offs from figures in the Californian art and music scenes, as well as exclusive tracks and edits from better-known artists, making it one of the more valuable artefacts from the ambient compilation world. A track by Artificial Paradise is also present, an artist who was around in the early mp3.com days, as well as a regular member of the FSOL List discussion mailing list, and whose album Shooting Up Sugar I downloaded in 2000 or 2001. Can't find any trace of it anywhere online these days, sadly, because it was a great album. Stylistically, the compilation is very much what one might expect from Silent Records: dreamily light synths, laid-back beats, whale song and ocean wave samples. Lacking the diversions into trance, techno, dub and IDM that most of the other compilations of this kind frequently feature, it could almost pass as a single artist album if listened to blind. Following not too long after, the second volume, subtitled Ambient Compilation for reasons, continues in a similar vein, but opens things up to a wider range of artists. Pelican Daughters, part of the experimental scene from which Silent had been born, contribute a surprisingly suitable piece of bleepy ambient. Legion of Green Men provide an uncharacteristically undubby number. Robert Rich lends one of his spacey synth pieces to the set, and things close with Pete Namlook's Air Track Wind, licensed from Fax. There are a couple of diversions from the album's overall sound, such as Single Cell Orchestra's Dubby IDM and Sirius Minor's Trance, but overall it's another strong set of largely West Coast hippie ambience. Maybe the strongest label compilation is Apollo's first, simply titled Apollo, released in July 93. Featuring mostly tracks from Apollo and in a couple of cases R&S 12-inch singles and EPs, plus album tracks from Biosphere and Aphex Twin, it's a brilliant way of bringing together some of the best obscurities on the label. It's particularly of note for CD listeners for whom most of these tracks remain otherwise unavailable. David Morley's remix of Kinetic by the Golden Girls, best known for its Orbital remix, transforms the piece into a sun-drenched ambient epic. Morley's own Evolution is a gorgeous piece of bleepy down-tempo with violin samples adding atmosphere and texture. The flute-led Paradise by Atlantis is one of the album's highlights, an absolutely stunning track and one of the highlights of the whole era. Things head into dubbier down-tempo territory for the final few tracks, before slipping into ambient trance for the closing piece by Neuro. Apollo is a rare compilation where every track is a winner, and with the comparative obscurity of many of these pieces, it's one of the few various artist collections that I consider essential listening. Recycle or Die's label compilation, Silk, holds no new material and plays out more like a label sampler, although it's a decent enough set of tracks in its own right. On the Psy end of things, Planet Dog began their Feed Your Head series. The Trance Europe Express series also launched the first of 5 2-CD sets featuring exclusive tracks and mixes from electronic artists covering ambient, techno, trance and IDM. These sets all included a 192-page booklet with interviews with the artists involved, and was a spin-off from the Volume series, itself featuring electronic artists among acts of various other styles. Fittingly, 1993's Volume 8 includes Auteca B12, Higher Intelligence Agency, Juno Reactor, Global Communication and Sun Electric. For the most part, following this set, the Volume compilations focus on rock, indie and hip-hop, with the Trans-Europe Express series taking over the majority of the electronic tracks. The major labels weren't to be left behind, and Virgin chose 1993 to launch the first 2 volumes of its A Brief History of Ambient series. At this point, ambient was the big thing in electronic music. Virgin knew this, and realising they had a hefty back catalogue of ambient music to profit off, and with no upfront costs in terms of licensing, this was a no-brainer for them. After all, they owned the rights to music by a number of hugely acclaimed ambient artists, so we get a 2 CD set of some of the finest ambient music ever recorded over a 20-year period. Trance alone gives you an idea of the quality. Harold Budd, Laraji, Eno on his own as well as with Fripp, Budd and Hassel, Tangerine Dream as well as tracks by members Edgar Fruays and Christopher Franke, David Sylvian, Roger Eno, Holger Suke, Ashra. At the time, FSOL were the only contemporary ambient act on the label's roster, so their amorphous androgynous track Mountain Goat appears, but the modern scene is filled out with an Orb remix of Killing Joke, a mellower grid track, and even some dub from Bill Laswell's Material project. Compiled by Virgin co-founder Simon Hayworth with liner notes from music journalist Simon Hopkins and art by FSOL's in-house artist Buggy G Riphead, it's as good a set as one could imagine from something that was, in part at least, a bit of a cynical cash grab. With so little modern material to choose from, the album isn't actually that heavily related to the ambient house scene at the time, but in attracting fans of the then popular style, it almost certainly introduced thousands of new listeners to all these classic artists and massively popularised an era of music which had become semi-obscure by the early 90s. The second volume followed a few short months later, with a very similar selection of artists on board. Clearly the first compilation sold well enough to justify a second. Ambient was now a big seller. Caroline, one of Virgin's American sub-labels, created an especially well-loved series called Excursions and Ambience, which attracted a surprising number of less-known and exclusive tracks over its 4 volumes. With a single hour's runtime, their first volume is less an attempt to put out as much related material as possible, and more a chance to create a single consistent listening experience, and that's a big part of why this series is so loved. There are some big names there. Higher Intelligence Agency, FSOL, albeit before they delivered material to Virgin and thus an accelerator track Calcium appears, Psychic Warriors of Gaia, System 7, Banco de Gaia, as well as tracks from lesser known down-tempo artists. Among these are Maya Yanda by Tranquility Bass, featuring Michael Kendall from Instinct's first chill out set, a lovely down-tempo track overlaid with atmospheric field recordings, Terrena by Psychedelic Research Lab, which veers wildly between Indian classical, trance and jazz, and a sweetly mellow closer from Sub Sub. Fittingly, the series quickly moved to Caroline's electronic imprint Astral Works after it opened, and Volume 2, the second Orbit, looked forward by including a few techno-leading tracks from the likes of Locust and Auto Creation, as well as a brief liner note essay by Orb manager Adam Morris, aka Mr. Modo. Other notable artists include Schizophrenia, aka Thomas Fellman, and Basic Channel member Moritz van Oswald, with the dreamy beatless techno of their self-titled track, the fascinating ambient dub meets dub techno of the Orb remixing Basic Channel in Maurizio's Ploy, the dubby breaks of Megatonk featuring future Emmett label owner David Thompson, and a further 2 Orb remixes. What looks like a varied selection on first glance is in fact a very tight-knit group of artists. Mr. Modo's role in curation here sees him selecting tracks entirely from the Wow Mr. Modo catalogue and the Orb's recent remix history. The cynic might see this as a way for him to get some extra royalties, but who knows. At the same time, with most of the tracks related in one or more ways to the Orb, Basic Channel and Locust, it gives the compilation a unified feel. EMI's house imprint, Positiva, even threw out a compilation, the Positiva Ambient Collection, with a surprisingly solid collection of tracks from the likes of The Orb, Aphex Twin, Orbital, The Irresistible Force, The Black Dog, Moby and Beaumont Hannant. And then there was the start of the proper cash-in compilations, sets which are ultimately only loosely connected to ambient, such as Angelic House Ambient Love Collection, a trip-hop and down-tempo house compilation. There are also a few broadly one-off records which deserve a little attention, none masterpieces but all containing at least some material of note. Nicholas Teloglu's debut release as Telo, Eternal Thoughts, was released on Nova Zembla, a Belgian label that started out licensing trance from Australia's Psyharmonics before moving into a more techno-leaning direction later in the decade. It briefly dabbled in ambient-leaning techno for a couple of years before this was taken over by its sister label Radical Ambient. Eternal Thoughts is effectively ambient trance, with a number of tracks being led by four-to-the-floor beats and synth harps. It never gets too hectic though, with close ties to more laid-back trance put out by some fax artists of the same era. Many of the tracks feature richly layered synths and samples such as Ambient Opener, Sweet Nothingness and Gentle Trance Number Off. Elsewhere, things are brought down tempo on tracks like the murky Real Emotions and the beatless closer Epilogue Zero. The one thing that lets the album down is the use of presets. I wouldn't be at all surprised if the entire album was created using FM synth presets, with a lot of the sounds incredibly familiar to anyone who's heard much electronic music from the late 80s, and those sounds sadly cheapen the album a little. Edge of Motion, a Dutch techno duo with a large number of 12 inches behind them and their members' other projects, released their debut album Planet Gong Realities as a CD-only release in '93. Opening with a very respectable ambient piece, all gurgling arpeggios and tropical field recordings called Morphic Resonance, a title that occurs all over the place at this point, the album quickly moves into more techno-leaning material, albeit generally laid back. There are plenty of breaks for more ambient-leaning tracks, however, such as the creepily atmospheric Insanity, showing the group are as adept at subtle down-tempo as they are dance-floor-friendly fare. Indeed, the album's longest number, the 15-minute title track, is all spacey pads, bass throbs and distant drum machine echoes, while Stelio Lizards recalls the Orb's Loving You reframed as cold, techno-oriented ambient, in contrast with that track's house warmth. While the continual flipping between techno and ambient is maybe slightly jarring, and there's nothing especially unique here, Planet Gong Realities is a very proficient album, and one that's unfairly overlooked. Spacelab's self-titled record is an interesting one. Recorded between '88 and '92 by two musicians with little in the way of an obvious dance music past, it feels like it should be more new age related, and at times there's a touch of that style to what we hear here, but on the whole it's really quite good soundscape material, blending electronics, acoustic instrumentation and field recordings. The pair have no qualms about moving into more abstract experimentation, such as on Acid, or dubby tribal sounds like Night Train. One great thing about looking for ambient from the 90s is coming across odd obscurities like this, and while yes, the vocals in reality are utterly unnecessary, as a whole it's a fascinating album with lots to offer. Young American Primitive's debut album is one that frequently comes up in directions of less remembered 90s ambient leaning records, although it's barely ambient really. There are atmospheric elements, Opener Transformation is laden with spacey samples, but it's so heavy with breakbeats that any definition of ambient would struggle to really include it. That said, there's some wonderful tunes here, and the sampling is spot on, and it often heads off into outer space, so anyone looking for a record in this vein but with much more of a pulse will find a lot to love here. The closest stylistic comparison I can think of is probably FSOL's Accelerator, another album heavily rhythmic but still putting textures at the forefront. Neuro appeared on Apollo's self-titled compilation in '93, and they also released their own album under the name Neuro Project, entitled The Electric Mothers of Invention. It's an intriguing set which combines a number of approaches, largely on the techno end of things, but then there are tracks like the 15-minute Wizard of Four Winds, a lengthy montage of gurgling water noises, didgeridoo drones, dubby breaks and oddball sampling, the whole thing doing a better impression of the Orb than almost anyone else in the scene at the time. The spy film flute and chunky drums of IDU are both laid back and sinister, while Huichol is shimmering ambient techno that races ahead on high-paced rhythms but remains chilled due to its lack of kick. Like many similar albums, I'm not sure how well it all sits together as a single consistent listening entity, but there are plenty of things to really enjoy about the Electric Mothers of Invention. And that's it for this brief video, just tying up the odds and ends of 1993. It's been a hell of a year, lots of videos and a lot of music covered. I would love to hear your thoughts on the compilations and oddities I've discussed, or about any of the other releases I've discussed in '93 and the year as a whole. There are also like, share and subscribe buttons you might also like to press. And for those of you who use Spotify, check down below in the video description, there should be a link to a Spotify playlist that accompanies this series of videos. I'll be updating that with all the material I cover every time a video comes out. Next time I'll be going into '94. You thought '93 lasted a long time? '94 is the motherlode. I'll see you then.